The House Judiciary Committee has voted on legislation to break up certain big tech firms, including Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook. This is the first vote to formally restructure these major companies since the 1996 Telecom Act and the Bank Holding Company Act amendments of 1970.
Research director for the American Economic Liberties Project, also the author of Goliath, which you can see behind him. You should absolutely buy and read. Matt Stoller joins us now to discuss these bills. Welcome back, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Where do you think these bills go from here? How much do you think these things get changed as they sort of go through the grind of the legislative process?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are 6 bills, and 2 of them are general purpose antitrust bills that apply to everyone in the economy. It's more funding for the agencies and something to help state AGs avoid forum shopping by monopolists. Those are likely to pass. And then you have 4 tech-specific bills that include bills to break up these firms, to stop these firms from self-preferencing their own services, that force these firms to interoperate with rivals and partners. And these bills I don't know that they're likely to get through this session of Congress. 1 or 2 might get through in a sort of weakened form. This is kind of the conventional wisdom. But I think in the next 3 or 4 years, they're all likely to get through, or some version of the breakup bill is likely to get through, because what we've seen is for the last few years, the argument for breaking up these firms keeps getting stronger. And so while the bills pass narrowly in committee, the dynamics on both the right and the left are set to make the case to break up these firms more adamantly going forward.
And Matt, I wanted to ask you about a particular moment in the hearing. For a generation or so, the way that Congress often legislates is they brought a broad legislative package, and then they instruct regulators to go forward and execute their wishes. And during the hearing, a Republican member of Congress said, "Well, you know what? If we're actually going to suggest that Apple be broken up, let's put that in the actual legislation rather than saying like." All companies that start with the letter A and end with the letter E and have more than $4 trillion and blah. And it seemed like that was an earnest suggestion that was then received earnestly, and that Congress is going to actually try to do that. Is that realistic?
It's a really important question because I worked on Dodd-Frank. I know you covered Dodd-Frank, and Dodd-Frank was they basically said to regulators, hey, don't let that happen again. And we're not going to tell you how. We're not going to give you any policy ideas. We're just going to empower you to sort of make it less awkward for us next time we have to bail firms out. And so what happened, the regulators didn't, from my perspective, and I'm on the left, the regulators didn't do anything about Wall Street. Even though they had the ability to break up banks, they didn't. But from the right-wing perspective, they used all this vague authority that Congress gave them to be tyrants. And the irony here is that both critiques are kind of true. When Congress defers key policy decisions to regulators and doesn't make the decisions themselves, you can look at regulators as all-powerful tyrants, or you can look at them as feckless and useless actors who don't do anything. And so in this particular case, we're at sort of a left-wing progressive group, but our critique of the bills is that they were too deferential to regulators. They didn't make the key policy decisions in the actual legislation. They just said to regulators, hey, if firms have conflicts of interest, if there are lines of business which conflict with each other, then you have to break them up. But they didn't say, this is what a line of business means, for example. They didn't really define conflict of interest sufficiently. And so this is a kind of they just didn't think through what they wanted to do. They gave a lot of power to regulators. And so at a certain point, Dan Bishop, who's a Republican, and seems like a very good lawyer when I was watching him in the hearing, he said to Pramila Jayapal, who was sponsoring the breakup bill, let's actually sort of try to work on this. It wasn't quite as broad as I'm talking about here, but he was saying, look, let's just expedite the process, not let the regulators make such broad decisions, and just go to courts, expedite it to the Supreme Court really quickly, boom, get her done. And it was appealing. And I think, Congresswoman Jayapal was like, this is appealing. They couldn't work it out at the hearing, but they might get it through on the floor. It doesn't fix everything because there's still a lot of power that's going to be a lot of key policy decisions to regulators. But I think what we're learning is that And I think part of this was the mistakes that we saw with Dodd-Frank and the mistakes that we saw with Obamacare and sort of the broad policy packages where they just defer a lot to regulators, is that Congress has to relearn how to govern. They have to make very specific arguments. They have to make very specific policy decisions in statute. And so these bills, while they had some weaknesses, they're a real step forward for Congress kind of relearning how to govern. And that's what's so exciting about this was the sort of the Bishop Jayapal, I think it was maybe like a colloquy is what the formal nerdy term is. But when they were basically talking, saying, hey, let's figure out the details of these bills to make it right.
I love the point you made about the overlap between sort of left and right complaints about the administrative leviathan. It makes it so much easier for Congress to sort of kick the can to them. And I wondered, the Bishop Jayapal union here, do you think that really has tech worried? Do you think that means to the tech industry sort of sitting and observing this process, are they expecting some of these really heavy changes to actually be implemented? And if so, are they preparing to kind of absorb them and continue on their way?
I don't think tech, we've basically had, but depending on how you count, between 20 and 40 years of elite lawlessness, right? So I don't think tech is going to be worried, big tech per se, is going to be worried until something happens, right? So they won't believe that anything's going to happen until something happens, which is to say a breakup, handcuffs on someone, something meaningful that constrains their power. All of this stuff, I think, to them right now is noise, a sideshow. And it's hard to make the argument that it is anything but that, simply because, recent history anyway, is on their side.
Matt, how does this change if Republicans take either the House or the Senate or both?
That's a great question. The answer is I don't know, because the Republicans don't know. You have this really bitter fight on the right between Jim Jordan and Kevin McCarthy, who are really kind of cynical and are sort of posturing about, their bills won't really break up big tech. We have this other proposal to deal with censorship against conservatives, but it's really just cynical. And they're really not actually trying to improve the bills to accord it with conservative priorities. And then you have Ken Buck and Matt Gaetz and a couple of other conservatives who are saying, no, actually, these bills will address the problem of big tech, or at least parts of the problems of big tech. And that's mirrored on the Senate, where you have Mike Lee, who's trying to uphold the status quo, and you have, senators like Josh Hawley who are trying to address this problem differently. And in some ways, Amy Klobuchar is kind of in the center of that. So you have this kind of strange dynamic where both parties are very much split. And I don't know where the Republican Party goes on this, because, I'm not a Republican, but also it's a very live debate. And I think the Republicans could go kind of either way on this. I mean, generally speaking, I've been sort of surprised at how much they've moved towards breaking up big tech. Clarence Thomas, I think, has been a big figure there. But now we're in a different part of the debate where everyone's kind of acknowledging, okay, we got to break these guys up. We got to do something about this. But a large faction led by Jim Jordan is doing that in bad faith and just engaging in sabotage. I don't know how the Republicans deal with that, whether they which side they go to, because they do they hate the left more than they want to break up big tech is the kind of question here.
It's a great question. And, the money is with Jordan, but the momentum is with Ken Buck. I think the strength of Jordan's opposition was surprising to me. And it's really the first flare up of, I would say, almost Trump wing of the Republican Party opposition to some of this new tech regulation. It's super interesting. Matt, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, Hill reporter Alex Gangitano joins us to discuss UFOs. Stick with us, you won't want to miss it.